Hey everybody, I wanted to do one more video today. This is about Intel and some stuff that people are kind of up in arms about that they're doing recently. And it's called software-defined silicon. I don't know if they're doing it necessarily already or just thinking about it, but I believe that they're actually doing this. Intel's been doing some interesting things recently. So one of them is Intel Arc and their Xe discrete GPUs and the new laptop GPUs that they have, which seem promising anyways. It'd be really good to have another competitor against AMD and NVIDIA. Another thing that they've done recently is Alder Lake, the 12th gen Intel Core i series, which I think that the reason that Windows 11 has come out so early and is basically beta is because Intel needed Microsoft to get Windows 11 out, because Windows 10 doesn't fully support Alder Lake. And Windows 11 does. It has a scheduler that can't be used in 10, but is used in 11. And that allows it to use those efficiency cores. Intel's kind of doing like a big little type of thing, which ARM's been doing forever in phones and tablets and Chromebooks. Intel's now doing that, and Windows 10 wasn't able to manage that. Windows 11 is. So it seems like Windows 11 came out for that reason. Came out early and is still basically in beta. And that helps Intel to compete with AMD, but it also helps Intel and Microsoft to compete with Mac and the new M1s and M1 Maxes and M2s and whatever stupid naming system they've got for their new ARM chips that they're running in Macs. So it benefits Microsoft and Intel, even if Microsoft is pushing Windows 11 out a bit early, and that's why I haven't done anything with it, because it seems like it's still basically a beta product, honestly, and it was pushed out for Alder Lake's sake, is what it seems like. This is another thing Intel's doing here with software-defined silicon. Basically, you buy a Xeon CPU. There are additional features baked into the hardware that you can unlock for an extra fee. And people are pissed off about that because they're saying, more or less, I bought this CPU, I want all of the features of it. Why? How can you charge me for something later on? You can read through this if you want. This is on Tom's Hardware. There's a lot of other videos and commentary on it and so on. But I think people are looking at it in the wrong way. This could be really awesome, actually, depending on what Intel does with it. So here, they're trying to charge you extra money for this additional feature. And I forget, honestly, what it even is. Get out of here. What the workload is that's needed that is added when you pay more money later on. But imagine if you could buy a system, any system, let's say a used Core i3. By the way, I've got a used laptop that is new to me, another Dell, because I love those Dell Latitudes. I'll make videos about that shortly here, but not today because it's a little more involved than simple commentary. Imagine if you bought a laptop like that with a Core i3, used, 3, 4, 5 years old, and could pay Intel money to upgrade it to an i5 or an i7 without actually having to take the thing apart or change any parts. You could still buy it at the original low Core i3 price. You would get the hardware that's in an i5 or an i7 or an i9, and you could upgrade it when you have the cash or when you have the need. That, to me, is ideal. And I could see Intel doing that. Now, if they make it into a subscription service, that would suck. They shouldn't do that. But if you look at the way chips are made, you start out with a chip. There's now oftentimes a bunch of chiplets on there. Sorry for my chip and chiplets. And then there's usually, with AMD anyways, there's also an I/O chip. All of those chiplets speak to the I/O chip, and that speaks to the I/O as well, PCI lanes, SATA lanes, and so on. Intel is getting into chiplet, more or less. They've got a couple of technologies. Foveros is one of them, and I forget the other one, 3D stacking maybe, which is basically chiplets. But imagine, the reason that they're doing this is because on one circular wafer, you can only cut so many chips out of it. And so, I'm going to do that. So if you've got this circular wafer and you can cut out a certain number of chips, the smaller the chips, the better, because if you have smaller squares here, and the chips are always square, you can get smaller chiplets out of it, and you can put multiple chiplets together. You can get more out of that one single wafer because of simply a square being made out of a circle. With smaller squares, you're better off. And so if you take a lot of these smaller squares and patch them together like AMD has done, you end up with more compute power. So when you look at like AMD, they might have a 48 core or a 64 core EPYC, let's say, or Threadripper. What they do is those chiplets themselves, since there are 4 of them, the 48 might have 12 cores on each. I think actually they're using 8 now. So let's say 6 cores on each, and let's say this one's a 24 core. If they're able to enable all 8 cores, this would be a 32 core. What's happening is on these individual chiplets are also broken down into individual cores. And what they'll find is one of these cores might be bad, maybe 2, maybe 3. And so they'll take an 8 core and they'll laser off 2 of the cores so that it's not functional. It doesn't affect the other 6. They can still use that in a 24 core chiplet. Or chip rather, without having to throw it out. It's not waste, even though not all of the parts work. But as manufacturing gets better, their yields get better, and more of those cores do work. So you may end up with a chip with 7 working cores, or even 8 working cores. And instead of lasing off those 6, they'll just cut them off in software, and firmware. So imagine if you could buy, let's say a 20 core chip, whether it's Intel or AMD, with only 4 of the cores functional, where Intel or AMD make the same exact chip, every single one's exactly the same, their yields are good, their performance is good. This is a hypothetical, I know it's not really happening right now. And they cut them down depending on the price segment that they're being sold into. But then you could take that Core i3, pay money to Intel after you've already got it, and turn it into an i5 or an i7 or an i9 by unlocking those additional chips, those additional cores that are in the chips already. You could do the same thing with cache. Part of each chip is cache. There are other hardware things in there. And in this I/O chip, there are additional technologies. So let's say you bought a chip that's made to support 8 SATA lanes, but you need 20. I don't know why. Maybe you're building a server. If you could pay more to unlock 20 SATA lanes in that one specific chip, in that one specific CPU, I should say, that would be fantastic. You end up with fewer of these going to the trash. And that's kind of how I look at the future of what they're calling software-defined silicon, where your silicon's all the same, but you segment it based on the market, and you segment it in software rather than in hardware. So rather than lasering off cores, which may still need to be done if the cores are faulty, but rather than lasering them off, or rather than cutting them off with software, you can cut them off with software, but not permanently, temporarily, so that they can be purchased later on. That would be fantastic. You could take even a low-end Chromebook, let's say, and upgrade the CPU, which is soldered to the motherboard, without changing a single thing with software, and that would be amazing. Back in the day, I don't know if it's done often, but back in the day we used to do this with graphics cards as well, where you might get like, I don't remember which ones were good at it, but you might get like let's say a 7850, and that 7850 is actually a 7870 chip from AMD, but they've software blocked in the firmware some of the cores so that it can be sold as a 7850 because there's more demand for it because of the lower price and people's requirements, of course. And what you could do is you could take the firmware from a 7870 and put it onto that 7850, and you would have a 7870, in that case, for the price of a 7850. And it really only happened in a few instances, and those people who bought those lower end cards were just lucky that they were able to get more cores out of it and that they weren't lasered off, they were software blocked. Intel could easily do the same thing. AMD could easily do the same thing. On the other side of things, something that AMD is doing, which I really dislike, is, let me get up here, vendor locking their chips. So we've seen this in Lenovo specifically, and by the way, Serve the Home is an awesome website for server stuff, but also some general knowledge. What AMD is doing is allowing the vendor, Lenovo, HP, Dell, whoever, when they put their processor in there, to then lock that processor through a what they're calling a fuse, so that that chip can then only be used in Lenovo machines. And they're saying it's for security purposes, but I don't really see the issue there. Maybe I don't understand it well enough. It seems more like they're trying to force consumers to purchase new chips rather than relying on the used market, which a lot of people rely heavily on, myself included, by making it a less reliable market with a higher demand for these, not vendor-locked chips. And it's really unfortunate because things like this end up as e-waste rather than being able to, be upcycled and put into other machines. So I see Intel's idea of software-defined silicon, at least the idea, not necessarily their implementation, much more promising for the future compared to what AMD is doing with their vendor lock-in, which just seems like backwards. Like those two companies, what they're doing is backwards from what you would normally think of them doing. And really, software-defined silicon would greatly, would really help out AMD processors because they use so many of those chiplets and they're so small. And again, Intel's going that direction, but I don't know, I forget offhand, to be honest with you, if they fully taken up the same sort of implementation of using small chips to create large chips in the same way that AMD has anyways. So anyways, this is just sort of a rant. I'm hoping that this turns into something much better because it would be wonderful to genuinely, more or less, download more processing power. Really, they could do the same thing with memory. Sell every memory stick as a 32 gig stick, but just only enable 8 gigs of it if that's what you pay for. And then you pay for an upgrade later by changing the firmware that's in it. Now in that case, it's a little bit tougher, again, because memory chips as well are not perfect. And so the yields for the smaller chips are much better than for the larger chips. The same thing is true with Xeons and EPYCs and CPUs and so on. But if we get to a place where all the chips are basically equal and can all be top level, we can still, these companies can still segment the market by price. But at that point, they'd have the opportunity, they'd have the option to also allow consumers to upgrade with software or firmware. And that would just be amazing, in my opinion. Anyways, hopefully you followed along on this little bit of rant. People are up in arms about this, and I think that they're looking at it the wrong way. I think people are also pretty pissed about this, and I think they're looking at it the right way in this case. It's one of those rare situations where I agree with Intel more than AMD. So anyways, if you've got a strong opinion, you can write it in the comments. And other than that, yeah, have a great day.